Welcome to Liberated Together with Erna Kim Hackett, where we will explore the intersection of theology, justice, and all things women of color. Let's learn, let's heal, let's dream so we can co-create a way forward. Right now, we're diving into a series on worldviews, unpacking how the Western worldview shapes us and how alternative frameworks, practices, and worldviews can help us create a way forward. So let's dig in. I am new to the world of YouTube and podcasting, but I know there's supposed to be a musical interlude right now. I don't have music, so I'm going to sing this little song. Do 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 do. Erna doesn't know what she's doing, but she's having fun. Woo! I'm so committed that that at least I will have a good time while I'm doing this. So let's talk about worldview. Worldview can seem really academic, really abstract, but for me, it has become a very helpful, relevant, and transformational tool, especially in the area of theology and justice. I want to share some of how that's happened, and I have to start by talking about Dr. Randy Woodley. Randy Woodley and Edith Woodley are co-sustainers of Elohei Indigenous Center for Earth Justice, and Dr. Woodley was one of my professors in my master's program, and he really was the one who introduced me to Western worldview and maybe more importantly to Indigenous worldview. And once I had those categories and that language and those frameworks, it opened up a whole new world to me. The whole thing about worldview is it is the frame, the lens through which we view and experience the world. It is the container through which we move. So we might move from one side of the container to the other, but we never really interrogate the container itself. So that might look like, theologically, that might look like, oh, I used to not support women in leadership and now I support women in leadership, or I used to not support gay folks and now I do. So we move from within the container, but we don't really, I want to say exterminate, but I think the word I'm looking for is interrogate. We don't really interrogate the assumptions that theology is primarily an intellectual exercise. We still accept that theology is something that we should be argued into or out of. Our bodies, our cultural practices, our ancestral wisdom, our intuition still remain disconnected from the process of theologizing and God talk. So seeing how worldview is held in language has been really helpful for me. It began as people were introducing me to Indigenous worldview, and they would talk a lot about how inside Indigenous languages, and in this instance, a lot of Native American languages, is a value of responsibility and reciprocity with the land. And so I couldn't quite grasp it because that doesn't exist inside the English language. And then that made me start to think about, well, how does the English language teach me to talk about land? And I realized that I've been given language like natural resources and ownership. And I had never really questioned that before. But when you're told that the way we talk about land, even natural resources is considered one of the more progressive ways to talk about land, but it still approaches creation as a resource to be extracted from. And land is something that is owned, which then puts it inside the container of capitalism. And so without even realizing it, the words I had been given to talk about land and creation put it within certain frameworks. Lenore Three Stars, who is Lakota, she's one of the badass Indigenous grandmas. She's done a lot to introduce me to this Lakota idea of mitakuye oyasin. And I apologize because I know I'm not saying that totally correctly, but it's this idea that we are all relatives or everything is related. And that is how you talk about the land and the community of creation and people. So I realized there are ways that even the language I use is shaping how I see the world. This became more apparent to me as I began to think about how the Korean language works and how English works. So I was trying to translate something that I was saying in English into Korean. And I realized that even though I'm an only child, I was saying our mom. And I started thinking about how would I translate certain sentences that really start with like, I, this. And you can't technically say I, use the pronoun I and structure a sentence, but I realized it didn't come as intuitively. There's a lot of ways where when I was changing things from English into Korean, I would change to we, or I would structure the sentence so that the emphasis wasn't on I. You could almost say the exact same thing, removing that central pronoun. So then I started to think back on how much emphasis there is on the pronoun I in English. And I started thinking about like, isn't that interesting how you capitalize I? Like, why don't we capitalize the W in we or the you in us? Like I began to see that was a choice. This reflects the Western worldview's passionate commitment maybe pathological at times, commitment to individualism. It's embedded in the language. It only starts with capitalizing the letter I. There's lots of other ways we see this express itself. The other limitation of the English language is that we don't have a word for collective you plural. So in the South, this is y'all. But we don't have an easy way to communicate that we are talking to a group of people in the English language. Well, this becomes really problematic when you're reading texts where the you is almost always addressing groups of people, but then in our language, we collapse it down to an individual. So the vast majority of the Bible is addressing groups of people groups, cities, countries, empires, tribes, and all of those yous get collapsed down to a you, a singular person. What does that do to how we theologize then? It shapes what we think God is interested in. It shapes what we think Creator is interested in. We think Creator is only interested in you, the individual. So even though huge swaths of the Elder Testament and the New Testament are Creator or Jesus addressing y'all, our language and our propensity for individualism has us collapse that down to you. So, my classic example on this one is, I know the plans I have for you, right? That gets written on like a lot of Bibles and a lot of graduation. I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you. And it sounds like a great promise that Bobby can take with them as he graduates from college. But that is a promise that Creator is making to an entire group of people, the Jewish people who are living in exile. And if we completely erase that Creator is talking to groups of people, holding groups of people accountable, talking to groups of people and nations and empires about their sin and holding them accountable for that, if we collapse all of that down into talking to a specific person, it collapses our framework, our mental model collapses our ability to register that Creator is very interested in collective sin. What is now often referred to as systemic or institutionalized racism, from a Bible perspective, can be viewed as communal or collective sin. Something that Creator is really interested in and talking about all the time. But because of the Western worldview, because of our propensity for individualism, because of the limitations of our language, and because Western Christianity has been co-opted by empire, meaning that Western Christianity, white Christian nationalism here in the United States, has become a tool of empire. That means that theology has collapsed down into something that has to serve the agenda of the U.S. empire. And the U.S. empire is not interested in being held accountable or responsible for its sins. And I'm purposely using the language of sins. It's not one I dance around using as much very often anymore, but I think in this instant, it's appropriate and helpful. So the Bible is wildly interested in how a country like the United States is using its power and holding it accountable and naming sin as sin. Empire doesn't want theology that holds it accountable. It wants a theology that allows it to do whatever it wants and then can be punitive towards individuals. So then it takes that individualistic framework and creates a justice system that is really fixated on finding out if a single individual is guilty of something and then punishing them. But people and systems and institutions and corporations can never be held accountable because the language and also the framework of what is defined as wrong, and then theologically, what we are told that Creator is fundamentally interested in, all of that is erased. So it has really significant theological implications. It also has implications for how we approach our justice work. There's been a lot done on how fixated evangelicals are on sort of single personality driven churches and how we end up with the Mark Driscolls of the world. But this fixation on individual heroes also plays into how we approach our justice work. So figures like Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X, and clearly I love Malcolm X. If you only have the audio of this, you cannot see that I literally have a framed picture of Malcolm X behind me. What is often erased when these individual heroes get elevated is the communal, collective work, and specifically the work of Black women, and specifically the work of women of color more broadly. And the necessity of community building and community organizing in order to sustain any kind of long-term action towards justice. And when you erase all of that, and you overlay it with our fixation on the individual, it can get a lot of people thinking that justice work is about being a heroic individual. During the civil rights movement, the choice to have a forward person like Martin Luther King Jr. was a strategic choice, but he was always deeply embedded in a web of other people. Social media has added to that the sense that social justice work is about being an individual who has a hot take, a singular personality, who can use the right words or post the right things, but it's not about who is actually helping to build a better world. And for us to actually bring long-term change, we have to interrogate how individualism shapes our theology, how individualism shapes our approach to social justice, and how individualism also shapes how we think we will heal, and how individualism shapes how we do the work. For years, I have sat with the story of how after the genocide in Rwanda, Western therapists went over to help, which is wonderful, but they would pull people into rooms and do like one-on-one therapy sessions, which is very Western. And eventually, like, people in the community were like, what are you doing? We're not going to heal this way. We need to heal with our community, singing our songs, doing our ceremonies, laughing, grieving, crying, processing together. That has just stuck with me so profoundly. And I think we have to be careful about seeing spiritual direction, therapy, healing practices as things that happen one-on-one. And part of how we liberate, part of how we undo this internalized individualism is to embrace practices of group spiritual direction, embrace practices of group healing, group and communal grieving, group and communal ceremony, reinstilling, regrowing, and maybe learning for the first time how to move communally and collectively. One of the things I have to address, though, is in light of the community I work with, which is a lot of people who come out of evangelicalism, folks have been profoundly wounded by their communities, right? There's so much disillusionment. There was so much pain as people woke up in 2015, in 2020. And as folks were ousted from churches and nonprofits and ministries and communities that they had been told to call family, that they thought of as home, that had literally raised them since their youth, there was so much grief as that fracture happened. Now, as we're talking about justice work needing to be communal and collective, and community needing to be a component of that, though I would distinguish between the people we build community with and moving collectively. They're not totally the same thing. But when people with the kind of background I'm talking about come back into community, one, we have to acknowledge that folks are just so tender. It's a community of wounded people. It's a community of people who have recently experienced trauma. There's going to be a lot of mistakes. There's going to be re-injuring. And there can be this sort of dream that this time community will be this sort of idealized version that wasn't realized with the past evangelical community. And utopian dreams have never served us. And utopian idealizations of even what justice communities will be like don't serve, because even as we're building a better world, we are still building a world full of humans who are broken, limited, and there's going to have to be a lot of apologizing, making amends, making repair, figuring out how to do things differently moving forward. And that is hard, and that is tender, but that is necessary. So a couple final thoughts on individualism. In terms of ways we can move away from this sort of pathological commitment to individualism, we really do want to think about justice work as communal, collective, and slow, and working with people that you don't necessarily totally agree with. That can be a difficult reality in light of the truth that all justice work is urgent and all justice work is a marathon. Community building work is slow, and it can feel like it's never the priority in light of the urgent things that need to be addressed, but you cannot really address the systems that are causing the urgent if we don't do the slow behind the scenes work. We also really need our weavers, our community builders, our connection builders in this season. I'm getting some of that language from Deepa Iyer's Social Change Now, a guide for connection. This is a great workbook, and I've been using it in a lot of my cohorts. Weavers are people who build threads of connection, who find common ground, who can hold facilitating spaces. And we really need that. Right now, the way a lot of people understand social justice, it means you have to go to a protest. Justice work is primarily disruption work. Disruption is really one tool. It cannot be the only tool, and it may not be the tool that everyone is meant to participate in. I remember I was talking to a young woman in one of my cohorts who is a therapist serving a really under-resourced community. And she was like, well, I'm not really a justice-oriented person. Like, I never go to protests. And I thought this was so intriguing. Fundamentally, her work is justice work. Bringing mental health and therapy to this under-resourced community as a Black woman serving a Black neighborhood, that is justice work. But because of what had happened during 2020, the way social media is swinging things, she did not see herself as someone who was participating in justice work. And I think that is so troubling, because we need the whole ecosystem. We need a whole web of skills and types of people in order to bring about long-term change. I also think that folks from collective and communal cultures have a lot to offer. Our experiences, our cultures, our ceremonies, our practices have so much to offer. Now, this is not to say that collective and communal cultures don't have their own things to reflect on, but that's not what this conversation is about. So I'm not romanticizing collective cultures. We have our own stuff, but that's for another conversation. There is a wealth of wisdom and knowledge to draw from in this season where individualism has taken us to, or individualism is taking us really to the brink of disaster. So that's individualism. That's one way that the Western worldview works. Let's go on to a second way that the Western worldview works, which is categorization sorted into hierarchy. It doesn't sound very sexy, but it's such a wildly helpful framework to understand. So the Western worldview loves to separate things out into tiny little categories and then put them into hierarchy. So we see this a lot in science. And just for the record, I like science. I like science, fam. Okay. But there is a limit to applying a Western scientific modality. It is not a modality that needs to be applied to absolutely every way of knowing in the world. So let's explore that. So we see this in Darwinism, right? Categorizing all of the natural world and putting it into a hierarchy where humans are, of course, on top. Gender, categories, hierarchy, men are on top. Because trans people and non-binary people do not fit easily into the categories and the hierarchy, then they become considered an existential threat to the system. Race, categorize, hierarchy. We also see this happen in theology, right? Like Western seminary is full of systematic theology books, which tries to take the mystery of God and categorize and sort, right? Category God, category Jesus, category Holy Spirit, category afterlife, category sin, right? It just separate everything out. The weakness of this approach is that it really struggles to see interconnectedness. So the Western medicine is like this. Western academia is like this. Let's say someone goes in to see the doctor. Anything going on with their brain might fall under neurology, psychiatry, psychology, but then the interpretations of things might fall under sociology. Let's say that this is a Black person who's experiencing anti-Black racism every day. So that causes hypertension because when the world treats you violently every day, your body absorbs that. And you have digestive issues. Maybe it's leading to an ulcer because of the stress and the anxiety. But that's not one doctor, that's like 9 different doctors, because the way Western medicine parses that out is like, well, you know, the person who can give you medicine for the depression is not the person who can think about how that is resting in your body as hypertension. It's different than the person who can kind of analyze like the societal realities, right? Western ways of knowing separation, disconnection. Now, there can be some benefits to that, but the limitations of that is that there is this one human that is experiencing that there's one human that is experiencing that. And they don't experience it as separated, parsed out categories. But the Western worldview then has to go do like an $8 million study to be like, you guys, you'll never believe it. But when people experience racism every day, it makes their bodies sad. Like, Thanks for that, fam. Oh my gosh. Right. But that is the absurdity of like, there has to be all this like kind of, that's the absurdity of Western ways of knowing. And it makes interconnectedness opaque to those of us who have been shaped by the Western worldview. One of my first introductions to Eastern medicine came when I was in college. I woke up one day and had one of those knots in my neck where you cannot even like turn your head 10 degrees to the right. Like I could look to the left, but I could just, it was so painful. So my college roommate called her mom. I had no idea what acupressure was, but she's like, my mom and dad run an acupressure school and my mom's going to come and help you. No idea what was going on. Her mom arrives. She's like, lay down on this bed. So I lay down face down on this bed, not knowing what's going on, not trusting it for sure, but just like too respectful of an Asian auntie to like disagree. And her mom starts massaging these different pressure points in my hamstring. It hurt like hell. But 10, 15 minutes later, she's like, get up. And I could turn my neck. It was like magic. And Eastern medicine, their approach to the body is that the whole body is interconnected. And so you can, if you want to address something in my neck, you might address it in my hamstring, or you might address it in my feet, or you might address it in my hands. And so there are multiple ways of knowing. And the problem with the Western worldview is because it's obsessed with hierarchy, is it will always place its way of knowing at the top versus saying multiple ways of knowing can coexist. We don't have to like eliminate them from one another, and they each bring their own wisdom. But Western worldview never met an alternative option that it didn't want to destroy. So we see this separation and categorization come into how people do justice work. Some people are interested in homelessness, and some people are interested in DEI work. Some people are interested in the environment, but other people, and I think, yes, it makes sense for there to be specialization, but often these specializations agree with the Western worldview framework where poverty and racism are parsed apart from one another as if they're not interconnected, and how they all live under capitalism doesn't get interrogated. And the broader end goal of what we're all working towards and the systems that we would have to take apart in order to create long-term solutions, we never get there. So yes, I do agree in relief work and work that is specialized. And at the same time, we need interconnectedness work. And interconnectedness work is part of how we undo the individualism, and it's part of how we undo the weaponized hierarchy. One of the ways we can use understanding Western worldview in this way is it can help us understand how injustice is happening globally. Because one of the things I saw happen after October 7th was people from the United States were trying to overlay onto Israel and Palestine sort of the black-white binary, the racial frameworks that exist here in the United States, into the Middle East. And I was trying to do that as well. And I was kind of running into the limits of that. I was like, wait, who are the Black folks? Like, who are the marginalized people? And in trying to overlay the United States racial hierarchy, it was making it difficult for me to understand what was happening. But once I gained sort of a little bit more fluidity in terms of this idea that the majority of injustice is basically categorization, hierarchy that then justifies violence to those who are on the bottom of the hierarchy, I could move more fluidly into different contexts. So then trying to understand what was happening in Israel and Palestine became not about overlaying a framework from the United States, but it was, what are the categories? What is the hierarchy? How is that hierarchy justifying violence to what particular group of people? And that can help me understand how to analyze. That helps me analyze the situation. But then in order to understand who was being categorized, I even had to register the existence of Palestinian people. And it was so humbling for me to realize that I had not even really registered the existence of Palestinian people before that point. So I couldn't even analyze a situation accurately because I didn't even understand who was there. Another way we can see categorization into hierarchy is look at India. India has a system of caste, categories, hierarchy, Dalit people at the bottom. It justifies violence to those on the bottom. Like, Erna, what's going on? You just said that this is like an unhelpful tool of the Western worldview. And what I will say is it's unhelpful sometimes, and it is helpful. The point of understanding worldview is to become aware of it so that we are not trapped by it. And then we can figure out when it is a helpful way of analyzing a situation and when it is a limiting way of analyzing a situation. Any tool that I can have to be able to see and understand and process these systems is one I'm going to use. But I can see how that kind of categorization and hierarchy is weaponized in the United States or theologically, and then I will interrogate it. So how do we undo this? How do we undo the unhelpful ways that this kind of unconnectedness gets deeply embedded in us? I would say that creation is our best teacher in this regard. I know that sometimes, I know that a lot of us, when we think about creation and the environment, are paralyzed with a lot of environmental existential dread. I think creation is our best teacher in this regard. Our mother is still here. The community of creation is here. There is so much for us to learn by simply sitting with her, being with the trees. Pick any part of the community of creation and it will teach you about interrelatedness. It will teach you about responsibility. It will teach you about reciprocity. It will teach you about interconnectedness. So let me return to the Lakota phrase, Mitakuye Yasin. We are all relatives. How can we begin to view the community of creation as a relative versus a resource, as a relative versus something we own, as a relative and a teacher versus a source of wealth for us or for our people? We have to sit with our mother. We have to sit with creation. We just have to spend time with her. Put your hand on a tree. Let her speak. And I know sometimes it can be unsatisfying because we talk about these huge, we can look at these huge implications of how the Western worldview has gotten us to a really tragic place. But undoing worldview often happens in these very tender and hidden and unseen ways. There's a beautiful book called The Hidden Life of Trees, which I just loved reading, which just painted one of the most beautiful pictures of interrelatedness and interconnectedness in this one particular grove of trees. I'm going to end there, having introduced you to worldview, language, individualism, and the Western worldview's love of categorization and hierarchy. I'd be so curious how you become aware of this worldview in you and in your world and maybe in your field of work. And hopefully I've left you with a few ideas about how we can begin to move beyond the limits of these frameworks. And I would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts with me. You can always find me on Instagram at Erna Kim Hackett. You can find my work at liberatedtogether.com. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.